All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we are going to start working on our cultural patterns and processes activity for Australia. So the first thing you're going to want to do is put in the country name, Australia, the continent name, which is also Australia, and then the capital of Australia, which is Canberra. Let me see if I can find that for you. So let's see, Control F, capital. All right, yeah, Canberra. That is how you spell it. So those are the first three things we're going to fill in here. All right. So for politics, we are going to want to look for the government, and that is right here. So you're going to want to talk about the fact that Australia is a parliamentary democracy under a constitutional monarchy, meaning that they're still technically under the Queen of England, but they are not like directly, connected the way that you would be if you were in England. You can also talk about, let's see, that they have 6 states, 2 territories. You can talk about their prime minister, that they have a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, very similar to what we have in the United States. Any and all of this can be added into this section here. So it's really just kind of your choice as to what you want to put in. Now, as far as the population, that is mentioned quite a lot. There we go. Let's go back here. So you have a demographic section that you can look at to put information about population in. You could talk about the stuff here in the pyramid, the breakdown of, among genders and age groups. And you can also use the population chart here to find information to put in here. Now, as far as this one goes, though, I would probably use the pyramid the most because it's going to break down your population by age and by gender. So that one would be a good one. And then probably after that, then use this. But I would try to get most of my information from this section here. Let's see. Relocation diffusion. Okay, so this one is a little harder. I looked through the Read doc, and as far as I can tell, there's nothing that really pops out as just coming out and saying this is some stuff that was brought, like with Saudi Arabia, you had the oil industry where they discovered oil, but they really didn't know how to, pull it up. They didn't know how to process it. They just didn't have the ability and the knowledge and the equipment and stuff to do that. And so what they ended up doing there is they brought people in to help them. And so that was a pretty easy relocation diffusion. Those people brought in their ideas and technology on how to do this. Now, for Australia, I would probably have to go back in time. So you're probably going to want to go all the way back where it starts talking about how Australia was isolated. It was an island that was isolated, and that the Aborigines, or Aboriginals, developed their own culture. And then you end up having Britain come in as a colonizer, and they colonize Australia. And so they bring in a whole bunch of new ideas, new technology and stuff that the Aboriginals had never, run into, things like weapons, the big ships. There's just all sorts of stuff that the British brought in that you could look at as, a relocation diffusion. Their way of building houses, their way of, farming, getting rid of, waste, harvesting animals, like all that kind of stuff, was from, Britain, and the Aboriginals not having any contact with, what you would consider like the highly advanced civilizations that were kind of taking over the world during this time. They would not have had many of those, if any, of those technological advances. So for this section, that's what you're going to want to talk about. You're going to want to talk about the, British coming in and colonizing Australia, and bringing their ideas and stuff with them. Now, for cultural diffusion, you can also talk about that. So it's going to be here in the same kind of section here. So they talk about the art in Australia has a long history and can be dated back to prehistoric times. Of course, that really, really old stuff is going to be all Aboriginal art. But then you have, colonial art, early 20th century painters, printmakers, photographers, sculptors, and all the way up into contemporary art. So, of course, the Aboriginal painters and stuff like their art, their instrument playing, storytelling, and things like that. That would have spread through the population in Australia. The immigrants. And then, of course, at the same time, the type of painting and printmakers and photographers and stuff like that is going to be where you're going to be talking about how the colonials brought their culture and it spread amongst the Aboriginals. So now, of course, you have traditional Aboriginal like cultural stuff, and here it talks about how you have an increase in the Aboriginal population because they started to protect the Aborigines or Aboriginals rather. I don't know why I keep saying Aborigines. The Australian government actually put protections in, and so that ends up with a increase in Aboriginal population, and then of course this leads to a rebirth of Aboriginal art. And art is one of those things that people tend to share it amongst cultures. You have painters who, will go somewhere, maybe you have like a European or let's say a French painter that goes to, I don't know, like Spain, and they'll get, influenced by, the Spanish culture and stuff. And then, maybe their work is put over there and it influences the painters there. And so there's just this free exchange of ideas. So, when Aboriginal art becomes, more important or rather more widespread, that's going to have influence on, local art as artists gain inspiration from each other. So that is one thing you can talk about as far as cultural diffusion. Let's see here. There is another section that talks about immigration. Here, let me just. So in 1850s, you have a large influx of Chinese immigration due to the discovery of gold. You have 7,000 Chinese that come to work in the gold fields. And so, whenever they came in, they brought their culture with them. And of course, they were blamed for a lot of stuff, and there was a lot of bigotry and racism involved. But the Chinese, had their own way of doing things, and that would have possibly spread amongst the others that they were kind of working with and stuff. This doesn't give a specific cultural like breakdown of kind of anything that the Chinese may have brought with them. Just be aware that it is a possibility. Like they have their own way of talking and the way that they dressed. So that is possible. But for the cultural diffusion, though, I would probably focus on the Aboriginal artwork, and I would probably focus on the European cultural norms that are brought over whenever they kind of come through. The next section is cultural perception. So you can do this a few different ways. You could either give me like Australia as a whole, like kind of what their cultural perception is. The section in here, like they really talk mostly about the Aboriginal population. Whenever you get to the culture part, right here. So they're really talking mostly about the Aboriginal population. So like I said, you can give me Australian as a whole, like how you think the Australians based on what you've read here, would perceive the world. That would be their cultural perception as Australians. But remember, there are different types of Australians. So, like, a European descendant in Australia might have a completely different perception than an Aboriginal descendant in Australia. So that's another angle that you can use. You could also tell me how you think the Aboriginals would see the world, based on what you have learned about their culture. What would they find important? What would they not find important? Those sort of things. So either one of those is fine for cultural perception. I would accept either one. You can either give me kind of a generic Australian, which is mostly going to be probably, not the Aboriginal perception. Although I can't say that the Aboriginal perception is not very similar to the Australian perception. I've never met any. But you can also look at just the Aboriginal perception based on their heritage and their beliefs that are put into the Reid Doc. But that would be found here in this culture section. The last one, there is a language section, I believe. Let's see. Demographics. Well, here, let me use this. Okay. So here is languages, right? So Australia has no official language, but English is seen as the national language and is the most spoken language in Australian homes. About 76.8% of people in Australia speak only English. 18% are non-English speakers. Mandarin is also a dominant language spoken in Australian homes by 1.6% of the population. So, remember there's Chinese immigrants we were talking about. That's what they're talking about here. Other languages include Greek, Italian, Punjabi, Filipino, and Tagalog, and Arabic. So there is quite a lot of different languages in Australia. Let's see. Australian cities, Sydney and Melbourne, house more than 65% of non-English migrants who speak some 240 different foreign languages. So there's a lot of languages going on. So for this section here, you can just say, that the overall they speak English. That is kind of the most common language. But then you can mention how many different languages they have going on. So that would be good for that section. The religion, I don't know why they have a pie chart here, but the religion. All right, there we go. So the religion section is here. You can actually just copy this, copy it, and then, delete this, and then paste the religion pie chart. That would work. But you're basically just going to tell me kind of, what's in here. Read this and then kind of make cliff notes, tell me the percentage of each religion, that is found over here. And that's all you're doing from this religion section. All right. So this is the cultural patterns and processes work. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.